In this lecture, Islam, Mosque Architecture and Nation Building, a socio-political critique, I will be talking about my own theory of the idea of mosque architecture as well as the design of mosque architecture. Now, before I elucidate this theory, I need to do what I call a socio-political critique of mosque architecture and the idea of the mosque itself in Islam. Now, many times when mosques are talked about or written about in books and articles, it is always the building as an object, as a historical product, as a technological product, and sometimes also as a cultural product. It touches on the political nature and role of the mosque in what I call nation building. Now, looking at the mosque in various Muslim countries, I have the impression that the planning of the mosque represents what I called a sieged Islam. A sieged Islam means that Muslims are not comfortable living in a multicultural, multiracial environment and is always or are always thinking that they are under siege or at war in a sense with the non-Muslims. Now, this is supposed to be not the right way of Islam being part of a modern society, but this is the normal way, it seems, nowadays. And Islam is said to be under siege by what we call extremists or mainstream opportunists and an ignorant populace instructed by an outmoded religious education content. Now, the problem of the mosque is related directly to the problem of socio-political culture of Islam itself. And the socio-political culture of Islam is governed by what construed as religious education, whether it is done in schools, in universities, or in mosques. These are the elements that shape the minds of Muslims against the non-Muslims in a peaceful, democratic country. Now, the narrative of Islam is that is being played is to be exclusive, to be dogmatic, intolerant, and regressive against the backdrop of ideas on democracy, on civil society, on inclusivity, and the multi-religious nation state. Islam is seen as exclusive, meaning some people or some Muslims believe that they are better than others, and therefore that they are exclusively clean or good in that manner. Dogmatic means that they are relying purely on the idea of an Islam that cannot be interpreted by anybody else except by a certain official or cleric. And this is something which will govern the manner in which Islam is being taught. Islam chooses, or Muslims mostly chooses, the path of intolerance in dealing with issues that bridges the gap between Muslims and non-Muslim in order to, in one sense, protect the purity of the religion. And this is seen as regressive against the ideas of democracy in which people can form independent opinions as long as it does not include harming others. Civil society, the idea of societies to be respected regardless of their race and religion and to be given due dignity. Inclusivity, that many of the social rituals can be done together, although respecting each other's practices or belief system, to be inclusive, to be part of, and the idea that a nation state requires multi religious presence. Now, architects seem to be lost in the irrelevant world of historical typologies, sentimental styles, and sustainable pastiche. When architects receive projects of the mosque, they would most of the time pander to the community or the committee's concerns or ideas of Islam, and this means looking into historical typologies and just making some changes here and there, or subscribing to a certain style of mosque architecture. And if they are to be very innovative, sustainable architecture is always placed before the client. Architects would not question the socio-political role of the mosque and concentrate on the design of the box or the object of the mosque. Now, to start on my discourse on a socio-political critique of the mosque, we have to take a look a little bit at the politics of Islam and Islamic institutions in such countries like Malaysia. If we see the slide here, the Cina Babi Pendatang Elok Mati was part of a rally by what we call the Red Shirts in Malaysia in 2016, very recently, and that these statements were tolerated by the clerics because no one actually said anything against such a crass statement. We also have the incident of the Mufti of Pahang calling non-Muslims or anyone, even Muslims, who objected to the law about the cutting of hands or the RUU 355 and calling them kafir harbi. Now, the term kafir harbi is an ancient, primitive, traditional term that means that a non-Muslim or even a Muslim that has been known as kafir harbi can be killed on sight by any Muslims, and that would be justifiable homicide. Now, within the backdrop of this Islam, as I said, under siege, thinking that everyone around Muslims are enemies, not looking at them as neighbors, not looking at them as citizens, we have a situation where the mosque is seen as a fortress, as a place of exclusivity, as later on we will find out. But the idea that I wanted to portray in the slide is the situation of politics, and that can be read clearly in the mosque language. We need to understand that. Now we have also the incident of a official or an officer in the Jakim agreeing to the idea that non-Muslims being dirty. Now, we must understand that in the jurisprudence aspect of Islam, what this ustaz is saying is in a sense true, because these are the requirements of cleanliness for Muslims, such as the washing of private parts with water and so forth and so forth. But calling other people dirty within the construct of a nation state is something that should not happen. It is different when you are teaching Muslims about themselves, but not to compare with the others. The ustaz, in one sense, is teaching the truth, but not in the context of time and not in the context of socio-political correctness. And the Sultan is correct in reprimanding this person. Here, I wish to show that again, Islam as the under siege mentality and Islam being an exclusive community than the other people. And this is not a very good thing for a nation building. Now, the main message of my talk is that the mosque must be designed within the true idea of Islam that is inclusive, that is progressive, that is dynamic, that is tolerant, that is friendly within the context of each communal location. Now, this is an element of socio-political concept that must govern architecture. Many architecture students think that architecture only comes from technology like sustainability, or it comes from history, or it comes from some idea of style. But in truth, a real theory must come from the socio-political construct of society, because the building, whatever building it is, cannot stand alone as a construct of sculpture, as a construct of technology, or as a construct of decorating a box. It must be placed within the construct of socio-political context. Thus, a socio-political critique of mosque design is necessary to reinvent the typology into a more inclusive community facility. What I'm saying here is that instead of the mosque having the idea that it is a community center for Muslims, I am proposing that the mosque now becomes an inclusive community center for all. Of course, it is different than the Western idea of community center, but here there is some way that we can design in which certain aspect of rituals, values, and sensitivities of the mosque and Islam can be designed, but certain parts or portions of the mosque can be part of an inclusive idea within the community. And I think this presents the new theory of mosque architecture. Now, in my understanding, the mosque is actually not a sacred building, but it is only a facility. This point is very important because most Muslims consider the mosque as a sacred building like the Kaaba. But that is not so, because the Kaaba is a different thing. It's a different idea. It is not like the community mosque. It's a special historical religious temple, and it is considered a sacred building. Now, this ayat a verse in the Quran, and I will read it: true piety does not consist of turning your faces towards the east or west, but the truly pious is he who believes in God and the last day and the angels and revelation and the prophets, and spend his substance, however much he himself may cherish, upon his near of kin, and the orphans, and the needy, and the wayfarer, and the beggars, and the freeing of human beings from bondage. And he is constant in prayer, and renders the purifying dues. And they who keep their promises, whenever they promise, and are patient in misfortune and hardship, and in time of peril, is they that have proved themselves true, and it is they who are conscious of God. Now, this is a very powerful verse that can build a nation. In this single verse itself, it has already constructed the idea of Islam that can exist within any community, at any time, at any place. And the mosque should fit into this verse. We should not be looking at historical typologies. We should not be looking at stereotype styles. We should not be looking at any other concepts of the mosque, but understand this very concept of Islam, which says that it is not turning to the east or the west, meaning rituals are important, but it is not the most important thing, because the most important thing is about believing and also having a continuation of ideas with the past civilization, as it says in the prophets, believing in the prophets of the past, which is from Judaism and from Christianity. And then it says also spending in doing charity. And so the community and the individual is responsible for the needy, the wayfarer, the beggars, and also supporting the idea of dignity for human beings, all of human beings, not just Muslim. And so, if one understands this concept of Islam, definitely the concept of the mosque as an architecture product will be different. Another hadith, this is a hadith, whereas the other one I quoted was the verse in the Quran. Narrated Jabir bin Abdullah, Allah Apostle said, the earth has been made for me a place for praying and a thing to perform tayammum. Therefore, my followers can pray wherever the time of prayer is due. Now, this hadith outlines the idea that there is no need for a dedicated building for a mosque because the whole earth has been declared a mosque. A Muslim can pray wherever, and that would be valid. But of course, if you have the mosque, then you should or can pray at that place. Now, tayammum is the act of purification by the use of sand, because when there is no water, you can use sand or you can use dust that is clean. And so, the idea that the mosque is designed specifically for prayer may not necessarily be the right way of treating what the mosque is. Now, of course, many people popularly believe that the mosque is a prayer place. But how can that be so when it's already been declared the whole earth as a prayer space? And how can one justify 80% of the budget and of the attention specifically only for prayers and not on other functions that the mosque might play. Now, in this second part of the lecture, I would like to give an overview of mosque architecture in the Malay world in terms of its form and its description, its technology. This is necessary, even though I said that we need to understand the socio-political construct, and that is the one that must govern, but we must deal with the fact that mosques have already taken on certain language, and not to understand that language and the reason for why it has become that way is not an excuse to ignore the whole corpus of civilization and historical studies. Architects have to speak with language, and language always is something that is embedded in history. So we will see these various traditional vernacular, Sino Eclectic, Anglo Indian, Neoclassical, Modernistic, Regionalism, and Postmodern Revivalism, as well as Contextualism of mosque in Malaysia. The traditional vernacular mosque in this country is said to be or understood to be, with the coming of Islam, is a purely timber building. Now, the Malay world, because of its environment with jungles rich with hardwood, produce architecture like the house, the balai, the palace, the mosque, and many other buildings. They are all from the technology of timber. Now, it's quite curious to know that even though Malaysia or Malaya was governed by the Majapahit and the Srivijaya, both Hindu kingdoms, that has the technology of masonry, as we can see in some of the artifacts and archaeological finds, as well as remnants of buildings in Indonesia. But in Malaysia, only the Lembah Bujang produces the heritage of masonry architecture in temple architecture. But with the coming of Islam, what we can understand is that most of the mosques, or all of the mosques, are of full timber. Now, the construction of the house is usually in the rectangular fashion, but curiously enough, the mosque is made into a square section, and the roof is tiered, sometimes three, sometimes even more than that, and there are also two tiers. Why are these mosques designed in this manner? No one actually knows, and we can only conjecture. But the fact remains that the mosques are almost squarish, and they do not possess a minaret, and they have this tiered roof or pyramidal tiered roof without any serambi or veranda. And this is the form that it takes, similar to what we call the wakaf, which is just a pavilion designed so that communities can use it, anyone can use it, based on the Islamic principle of endowment. If you are rich and before you die and you say that you have left certain money to build a wakaf, and then whoever uses that wakaf, even though you are already dead, you will be getting the rewards from your effort when the time that you were alive. The traditional vernacular mosque can be seen here also in the two-tiered Masjid Papan, as opposed to the ones that I showed, Masjid Kampung Tuan and the Masjid Kampung Laut, which is purported to be the oldest two mosques in Malaysia. Here are mosques that are earlier, and they are built again of timber and no minarets. Some of them begins to have the serambi, which is the veranda in the front. Now there is a theory that these mosque typologies emanate or came from the Demak Mosque in Indonesia, which is purported to be older than the Kampung Laut Mosque. So the theory is that the mosque came from those parts of Islamic civilization, which is Indonesia. And there is also a theory that the shape of the roof either came from the pagoda or the wantilan, which is again another pavilion for the community. As I said, no one actually knows why this is so. We have also tiered roof, which are what we call the long roof or the gable roof, in such architecture as the Langgar Mosque, which is similar to the Arumenanjung Mosque in Thailand, or the Banten Mosque in Indonesia. So these are the rectangular type mosque that approaches the shape of the house more than the square form of the mosque. Other mosques in Indonesia, as I said, have various tiered roofs, which is more than 3. And again, these form typologies which we do not know their origin. And so, in summary, most of the traditional mosques are mostly of timber. They are of squarish in plan, although there are some in rectangular. There are 2-tier, 3 tiers, and more in Indonesia. Now, one possible reason why the square form of the mosque is because of the central 4 pillars that seems to carry the top tier of the roof, and some considers this as a kind of a dome. I said because there is no need of a masonry architecture, and perhaps the technology of masonry, cutting of stone, is not present here, and we do not have the type of clay that can form the adobe brick that is common in Egypt and other Central Asian countries. And so we do not know where the tiered roof comes from, whether it is the wantilan, whether it is the wakaf, or whether it is from a like architecture. This is something which the Sino Eclectic Mosque is characterized again by the tiered roof, pyramidal form, but here a masonry walls in terms of the fence, in terms of the walls are introduced, and we can see now a full serambi or veranda around the inner part of the mosque. We see also the introduction of the minaret, although some of these mosques like the Kampung Hulu, the Tengkera Mosque, they have what is called the Tabo house, which is by the gate or above the gate. And this Tabo house has a drum, which is either a wooden drum or it is a drum with stretched animal skin. And when the prayer time comes, the drum is beaten, and this thing is called the beduk, and it is used in order to inform the whole village because the sound of the human voice cannot go very far and there is no electrical loudspeaker system. And so the idea of the taboh house is a unique feature in the Malay traditional mosque rather than the stereotype requirement of the minaret. We see again the Sino Eclectic that imitates or comes very close to the temple architecture when we see the use of the ridged concrete roofs, the tiles, and the buah buton or the crown or mastaka, which is at the tip or at the crown or the mastaka or the buah buton is the one that is at the very top of the roof, which is in a sense weighing against the fitness of the tiles in order for it to be fixed as also part of the concrete ridges. And if you can see the concrete ridges, they look like the tail of the dragon or the dragon's tail, similar to the Chinese temple architecture. Was that a deliberate attempt to be like the temple, or is it just because of the functional need to have the ridged uh, cemented to fix the roof tiles? But then again, why this curved? And this is something which again is not in the knowledge of present scholarship on traditional. So the Sino Eclectic, the body is masonry, but the shape is still square, still the three-tiered roof. But we have the Chinese or the Dutch influence with the roof having the ridged, looking like a temple with this concrete or cement with a curved dragon tail at the end, which approaches more like the Chinese temple. This is the main characteristic. Of course, it also has the taboh house, which is something which we have to consider. There is another type of traditional architecture which is later than the timber and the masonry mosque of Sino Eclectic, which is the Anglo Indian mosque, which reached this the Malay world with the time of the British. The British brought in what was known as the Raj architecture from India in order to perhaps appease the royalty in this country, to propose the idea that Islam plays a major role in the politics of this country, even though the governance is from a non-Islamic British rule. So not only mosques were seen to be using the small domelets, the finials and pinnacles, but also train stations and offices. And we can see in the mosque architecture the proliferation of the onion dome, which is very similar to the ones in India. Now, this is the first time that the dome enters into the vocabulary of architecture design in Malaysia. Before that, it is the three-tiered timber roof form. And so, the dome becomes the main characteristic. The domelets, the minarets, multiple minarets in fact, bring in the idea of a Mughal architecture in this country. Now, the British also experimented with some neoclassical style, but it did not take off very much. Perhaps the Malays did not want to see a British or a European language taking over Islam. And they prefer the Hindu Islam or the Indian Islam heritage from India to the neoclassical British style. And only two mosques which can be seen to possess this language, which is the Sultan Abu Bakar Mosque in Johor Bahru, which has the classical arches and the language of classical or Palladian architecture, with a roof that is pyramidal but without any tiers, what we call the hip roof. And the domes are only small domes atop the minarets. And this architecture, as I said, did not take off in Malaysia and is buried within these two. When modernity introduced the use of reinforced concrete, what we call modern vernacular begins to show a language that has false arches and metal domes. And this is seen in many mosques in Kuala Lumpur and in Malaysia, where the mosque takes on some parts of the traditional language of arches, but in actual fact, the technology do not require it. But the language of the words is being taken up. A modernistic mosque that, in one sense, reinterpret the idea of Islam within the construct of a modern society can be seen in the Institute Teknologi Bandung Mosque that did away with the dome and puts in the modernist box, concrete box raised on pillars, and this forms the new architectural language that proclaims the idea of progressivism rather than blind obedience to traditional past. The Istiqlal Mosque is a masterful concept of form which is cubist and purist in nature, a very clean cube or box with a clean dome rather than all the finials and domelets of the Anglo Indian mosque. We have the An-Nahda, juxtaposition of cuboids here and there, and no trace at all of any traditional heritage of mosque. The Masjid Pupuk Kujang by the architect Nokman, and also the Masjid Aikib Malang, in Indonesia, projects the mosque into the unknown future with forms that have never been seen before and are not taken at all from the past. A total rejection of traditional mosque, interpreting Islam in a modern construct, and thus a modern mosque, because Islam in tradition and Islam in the modern democratic construct is different, or should be different, and so the shape of the mosque. But the plan remains the same in the fact that the prayer space is the main feature. Because, as I said, there was no critique of socio-political role of the mosque. The architect played with the form of the building only, but not on the role, and thus, therefore, the plan of the mosque. So the plan remains intact. The major space is the prayer space. Second major space is the ablution place, and other spaces are just subsidiary and seen to be secondary in nature. In Malaysia, we have the state mosque in Negeri Sembilan and, of course, the famous Masjid Negara, carrying the modernist language to its ultimate without any precedent of traditional forms, raising the box in a full tropical architecture layout. And Masjid Negara is the most famous and the best example of a mosque departing from the traditional concept. With its vast Serambi, there has never been a mosque in which the Serambi is bigger than the internal prayer space. But here the mosque is looked at as a kind of a large pavilion with walls that more as a kind of a curtain and temporary with grilled walls rather than solid ones, to show that it is a tropical architecture, it is a public architecture, it is architecture that reaches out to the people, not exclusive, and it is inclusive to all. The State Mosque of Negeri Sembilan uses shell construction to redefine the dome, while the Masjid Negara uses folded plate architecture to redefine the dome. But both are similar in the sense that at the central part there is some kind of a dome construct. As we can see in the traditional past, there is that. Even though I said that it has departed from the traditional past, but the planning again is for the prayer space, except for the Masjid Negara, which has a large Serambi area as multifunctional space. The Irshad Mosque in Indonesia reinterprets Islamic architecture by throwing out the arches and rethinking the calligraphy or ornamentation into a functional sun shading device that possesses the words or the sacred words of Allah or the names of Allah as part and parcel of the whole utilitarian aspect of the mosque. It's quite curious that the whole building exemplifies the Kaaba, and this is the first attempt that tries to emulate the Kaaba in the mosque architecture. In Malaysia, the rise of the politics of Mahathir Mohamad in wanting to challenge Parti Islam Malaysia on the idea of Islamic focus, Mahathir went on a building spree using the language of what I call imperial language of mosque architecture, taking from the great empires of Islam and placing it in Malaysia as part of the Barisan Nasional or UMNO's gift to the Muslims. This language is to show that he is a Muslim leader concerned about Islam and also trying to make Malaysia the head of the Organization of the Islamic Countries. And we can see the Federal Mosque, the Selangor State Mosque, having domes and minarets similar to the Ottoman Mosque, and the Masjid Putra having domes and forms and minarets similar to the Persian Mosque. Even though Malaysia is a Sunni country and Iran is a Shia Muslim country. Finally, we have some architects experimenting with new ideas of mosque, like the Aspa Mosque by Jimmy Lim, taking on the traditional path with its tiered roof. Again, the mosque has a prayer space, no socio-political critique again. Similarly, with the Said Now Mosque, this is called regionalism, as well as the Masjid Jami Al Sofwa, ignoring the dome but taking the typological form of the past and the literal interpretation of the state mosque in Malacca, which tries to emulate directly the Kampung Hulu Mosque there. In conclusion, I would say that the mosque is treated as a sacred, iconic object. It is not part of the urban fabric. It is different. It is iconic because it is said to be a sacred object of God. And this kind of architecture or language to me is antithesis or not good for the idea of nation building because it isolates itself. Now, some say that it is necessarily so because it is a sacred concept. But those who say so are part of a interpretation that is cultural and political. It is not part of the original message of Islam in terms of Muslims being part of a larger society. And so the idea of the isolated and iconic object, which is over sanctified, has been accepted. And this is actually the typology which I like to go against because that represents a different kind of what I call the siege Islam. And if we open up the idea of Islam as a more inclusive and more understanding and tolerant religion, we will not have an architecture of this nature. And so to me, the mosque is like a Muslim living isolated on an island, devoid of the global community and suspended in limbo vis-a-vis the historical and civilizational construct of humanity. That is how it is now. And we must get away from this idea, or else Islam will always remain in conflict with the greater part or the global community. Now, in this part of the lecture, I will define mosque architecture by asking the question of where our social and religious position are in society. Now, before this, you have heard me make statements about how the mosque reflective of the idea of Islam as a siege mentality, and I will show you the meaning of architecture that I have come across by analyzing two buildings, which is the Masjid Negara and the Masjid Wilayah. Now, if we were to look at the Masjid Negara, which was built in the 60s, and the Masjid Wilayah, which was built in the 90s, we see that what I have stated, the architecture of the mosque has gone from a dynamic, universalistic, inclusive, tropical, and humble architecture of the national mosque to the dogmatic, Middle Eastern centric, exclusive, non tropical, and monumental architecture of the Wilayah Mosque. Now, I will be defining what I mean by all these terms, which uses not only the socio-political construct but also the architectural form construct. And if you were to look at the Masjid Negara now, I have said that the mosque in Masjid Negara is dynamic. I mean here that it is not static in its form. It has changed. It did not use the past. It did not resort to the arch and the dome or the traditional three-tier roof and all that. It's purely a modern construct. And so it shows Islam as being very dynamic to change, not locked in history per se. Universalism. When we look at the mosque, we don't really feel that it is from a certain race or, for instance, whether it's Malay or whether it is Arabic, Egyptian, what so, because the architecture is totally new, and therefore we call it universal, and Islam as a universal religion rather than a geographical construct. It is inclusive. Why? Because it does not use a fence. And if there were a fence, it's only done in a very low and unobtrusive manner. And it speaks of a language of welcoming everyone. So it is inclusive. Tropical, it shows that the mosque is concerned about not wasting energy, not wasting money, and it is part of the simplicity and thriftness or the idea of Islam not wanting wastefulness. We can see the single minaret, and then the idea of the use of the pool in the Sarambi to cool the area is an excellent way of handling tropical heat. The horizontal aspect of the mosque or expression of the mosque is something that speaks of humility or humbleness. And this is the strong, what we call horizontal line, similar to Frank Lloyd Wright, who distinguished the idea of the strong horizontal that hugs the earth, or what he called the earth line. And that is not something soaring or arrogant, but something down to earth. Now, as opposed to the Masjid Wilayah, which is dogmatic, meaning that it cannot change. A dogma is something that cannot change. So, in this manner, it is a revivalistic architecture of the past, and it somehow reflects the Muslim attitude of fearing liberalism or progressivism and simply prefers to be tied to a particular form of culture, of politics, and also of a building. The Middle Eastern centric, it is locked in a geographic idea of an Arab architecture or some sort of Middle Eastern construct, and saying that those are the best forms of architecture. And this is not the right idea, because the Islam hasn't said or does not say goodness or piety depends on certain geographic location or racial heritage. It is exclusive, as you can see from the huge fences and gateways, as well as the moat that surrounds the mosque and makes it not only different than the urban fabric, but it also makes it difficult for people to come in into the mosque to be part of the whole community. And the idea of non-tropical architecture can be seen, unlike the openness of the Masjid Negara. This one has a closed fenestration because it copies the ones in Constantinople, where the Ottoman built their mosque, and the temperature there is different, or the climate there is different. And so, because it is a copy, we can see it being an enclosed structure rather than an open structure. Finally, monumental elitism is the idea or a language of architecture that has a single mass and it has a large setback, grand doorways, very symmetrical. We can see that the Masjid Negara is not symmetrical, and it is not part of a single mass. It has a mass that is meandering around, and it doesn't have any grand doorways or grand fences. So here it's monumentalism. It looks more like a castle, looks more like a palace than it is as a community center. So in summary, if you look at this mosque, from the design of the mosque, the reading is in language is that Malaysia, with a population of Malay Muslims that are uncomfortable with the non-Muslim citizenry. And this is what I call the siege mentality. And you can see it in the Masjid Wilayah with the big fans, with the huge moat, with the huge setback, and trying to show that Islam is all powerful with grand mass, central mass, symmetry like a palace. And so this is the language of the present idea of the mosque, which I think is not helping the idea of nation building, more destroying the nation by keeping the communities apart with this architecture. Now we come to the idea of, or a new theory of a mosque that I wanted to propose, which is more of an architectural contextualism, meaning that the mosque should be part of the community rather than away from the community or exclusively out of the community, the larger community. And here I say that the mosque architecture may cause a serious rift between Muslims and non-Muslim by virtue of its presence. And Muslim and non-Muslim political divide is heightened by the isolationist attitude of Muslims that affect architectural planning. Now, when Muslims try to isolate themselves because they say that they are better than others or they say they are cleaner than others, then this becomes a very difficult problem in nation building. And we can see therefore in the mosque with the fence ensuring that non-Muslims come in, people who are dirty should not be in, and things like that. This is not helpful. And I think this is a language that is part and parcel of a traditional construct of Malaya or Tanah Melayu that now should no longer exist in a Malaysia, which is a nation building or a nation state. Many Muslims believe that the populist language of mosque, in terms of dome, minarets, and arches, is a kind of a sacred art. No dome, it's not a mosque. No arches, it's not a mosque. No minaret, it's not a mosque. This is not correct because Islam in its history never had any of this, not even the building called the mosque. And it can be shown that there was no requirement to build a mosque. And I have already shown that the whole earth has been declared as a mosque. Now, when we look at some mosques in, say, the United States, we look at this Diyanet Center, which is a Turkish community in the United States, carrying on the Ottoman architecture in its Islamic center. This is in total contrast to the language of Maryland that has a maybe post-colonial architecture with some modern architecture, but certainly not Ottoman architecture. And this creates a great difference between the two communities and reinforces the idea that Islam is exclusive, isolated, and in many ways unfriendly to. Similarly, we look at the Islamic Center in Washington, D.C. It is more of an Egyptian architectural language. It is mass and its ornaments and its architectural language of arches, totally in contrast to the Washington neoclassical architecture. Now, when we study architecture, when we design a building, we need to be in context with the surrounding. And many architects designing modern buildings in Washington must respect the language of architecture of neoclassicism in the Washington architecture, but not so the mosque. And some Muslims say that they shouldn't be the same because Washington represents non-Muslim and this represents Muslim. Now, if we say that, then we are again reinforcing the idea of Islam being totally different Certainly, Islam is different in the sense that people have to pray, wear the hijab, but in many other respects, we are the same. We are the same human being. We have the same concern. Washington is concerned about justice. Islam is concerned about justice. Washington is concerned about the poor. Islam is concerned about the poor. So, over 90% of the things are similar. The value system. But by building this kind of architecture, it sets up 100% difference. And this is not helpful to integrate Muslims within the social or the larger social construct. Now, if the Muslims say that they cannot copy neoclassical architecture because it is the architecture of unbelievers or kafir architecture, then how do we reconcile that notion with this neoclassical architecture of the Sultan Abu Bakar Mosque in Johor? The Sultan Abu Bakar Mosque in Johor is clearly a neoclassical architecture and would fit well within the construct of neoclassicism in Washington, D.C. Now, this shows the dynamic side of Islam because Islam is so tolerant and magnanimous that it allows other languages to be part of its own culture, and there is nothing wrong with the mosque having this neoclassical language, even though it is the language of the so-called non-believers. If we look at the traditional Isfahan bazaar and we look at the location of the mosques in the old days, they were part and parcel of the urban fabric. They do not stand out too much apart from the urban fabric. And looking at the inside of the Madian or the Maidan, which is the public square in the middle for the people, we can see from afar some minarets and a little bit of the dome, but the most prominent architecture are the public arcades that is show off in the building or from the Maidan or from the public square, and that shows the strength of public city planning or the strength of public in Islam. And the mosque, as representative of the ritual of prayer only, is off the center rather than forming the center in the public square. Again, we can see here the activities of the square, and we can see the mosque as complementing the arcades rather than dominating it, and we can see clearly that this is architectural contextualism. Now, in modern contextualism, where the mosque is part of the urban fabric, we look at the London Central Mosque. Now, the London Central Mosque has a unique history. The land was donated by the Queen, and the Muslims wanted to build a mosque like the Washington, D.C., which has its own traditional architectural language. But the Londoners or the municipal council was not for it because London is both a modern city and a historic city. And so the introduction of an alien architecture is not part and parcel of the policy of the planning regulators as well as the spirit of the place. And so the mosque was toned down to be the simplistic cylindrical forms and hemispherical domes with the simple arches to be part of the urban fabric. Now, in Singapore, we look at the An-Nahdah Mosque. It doesn't have any of this form of the domes or the arches, but it does present the cube shape of the Kaaba, which is enmeshed within the other shapes or the other trapezoid or the trapeziums and the solids of concrete walls and glass forms. And it sits well within the context of the city. It shows that the mosque Now, for those who thinks that the mosque is so sacred that it cannot be changed, I put here some hadith in which it says that only the Kaaba is the sacred mosque, as well as the mosque of the Prophet Muhammad and the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, or the mosque where the Dome of the Rock reside. So other mosques are not as sacred as this, because it is already said by the Prophet, if you pray in the mosque, you get several 100,000 rewards. But if you pray only in a community mosque, it is not the same reward as the praying in the other mosque. So they are special, and they are sacred in the sense that they have historical context, but not with the ordinary community mosque, state mosque, or national mosque in any Muslim. Now, if you look at one of the theories of Islam and democracy, we see that Islam, from such scholars as Dr. Farooq Musa, who's the director of the Islamic Renaissance Front, he says that there is no such thing called the Islamic State, right? And that Islam should focus on the fundamentals of the civil state, such as justice, such as freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, good governance, separation of power, rule of law, and respect for human rights and economic equality. All these, as I said in my deliberation of the Washington Mosque and Washington DC state capital, 95 or 90% of the values of Islam and of the Americans are the same, and this is clearly shown here in these words of Farooq Musa. Only in rituals this is slightly different, but everything else it is the same. And so why should architecture be so contrasting? The Prophet also prohibited the building of grandiose mosques, monumental, iconic shapes, where in his fatal illness he said that Allah cursed the Jews and the Christians because they took the graves of their Prophet as places for praying. Had it not been for that, the grave of the Prophet would have been made prominent. Also, another hadith, the Prophet said there are people who, whenever a pious man lies among them, make a piece of worship at his grave, and then they make those pictures in it. Those are the worst creatures in the sight of Allah. He was referring to the embellishment of churches by the Christians in the medieval times, where great churches were built to say or honor Christianity, when in fact many of them will have political agendas of making the priesthood or the religious cleric to be within the political power rather than a spiritual power. And finally, I come to my own idea about the mosque from some examples of students' work. And I start by saying that Muslims must rethink their social and communal agenda by emphasizing activities that invite and engage the larger community. So first and foremost is the plan. The plan of the mosque must contain not only ritual spaces for Muslims, but also other spaces that non-Muslim can interact with the mosque. So the new architecture of the mosque must have a language of form, material, and plan that conform to the inclusive agenda of community engagement. Now, some Muslims may feel slightly uncomfortable with non-Muslims coming into the sacred, what they consider the sacred part of the mosque, but that is not necessarily something that is true. Islam, Muslims, and the mosque must be the community anchor in any society. This is what my ideas for what the mosque is going to take the form of. Now, for those who think that Islam does not condone the idea of inclusivity of other people, I give some hadith of the Prophet where Allah said to Adam. He said, I fell ill and you visited me not. Adam says, O Lord, and how should I visit you when you are the Lord of the world? He will say, did you not know that my servant so and so had fallen ill and you visited him not? Did you not know that had you visited him, you would have found me with him? So it does not say who was sick, but then those who show compassion are the ones that will be close to God. Again, it says here that Allah says that I asked you for food and you fed me not. Adam will say, O Lord, and how should I feed you when you are the Lord of the world? He will say, did you not know that my servant so and so asked you for food and you fed him not? Did you not know that had you fed him, you would surely have found that with me? So, doing good things like providing shelter for the homeless, providing food for those who are in need, is considered something like feeding Allah, helping to clothe him, even though Allah do not need to be fed nor need to be clothed. But this shows the compassion of humanity, and political policies must be made within the construct of these teachings rather than a racial, national, cultural construct. And so the mosque also should function as a welfare center for all rather than specifically only. Abu Dhar also reported that the Prophet said, he who separates the community within the span takes off the noose of Islam from his neck. Blessed is the wealth of Muslim from which he gives to the poor, the orphans and the needy traveler. No doubt whoever takes it illegally will be like the one who eats but is never satisfied. We see here that the hadith again encourages inclusivity of community, and also like the Quranic verse that says that the Muslim must help the musafir or the traveler, as well as the orphans and the poor. This should give some clues as to what the mosque function should be. Now, there are those who still think that Islam is only for one particular race, like in Malaysia. Malays are Muslim, and therefore the special privileges for Malays should be looked at in terms of only helping that race. And you can see here in this hadith where the Holy Prophet Muhammad SAW stood up when a dead body was carried by, and people told him that he was a Jew. Upon this, he remarked, was he not a human being, or did he not have a soul? And so that shows that the Prophet respected even the Jew um, as a person who with a soul and needed his prayers as well. So we see here also that it says, never a Muslim plants a tree, but he has the reward of charity for him. What is eaten out of what is charity? What is stolen of that? What the beasts eat of that? What the birds eat? That is charity for him. So if you plant a tree and the birds eat from it, and the beasts also eat from it, you get the reward. And if the bird, who is not a Muslim, and the beast is also not a Muslim, then the more so if non-Muslims, human beings, were to take benefit from the plant that you had placed on the ground and have grown, the rewards will come also for you. So Islam is part and parcel of exclusive. And here also the Prophet said, Muslim is one who is easy to make friends with people and also easily to be made friends of, and there is little value in a person who is difficult to make friends with and difficult to be a friend of. And you should look at the hadith and look at the present mosque architecture. You are non-Muslim, can you make friends with this Muslim if you look at the architecture? Certainly not, because it is an isolationist architecture, it is an iconic, it is a separatist architecture, something that is separate from the construct of community. Finally, one of the very strongest hadith saying that none of you has faith until he loves for his brother what he loves for himself. And so if you want security, safety, food, shelter, then you should also want the same thing for your brother. And brotherhood here means the larger brotherhood. Imam Nawawi even says so. It doesn't mean only the Muslim brotherhood. It's very sad to see people just interpreting it within the Muslim cultural. This report in the United States of Muslims wanting to build a mosque and was disallowed by the Planning Commission. Then the Muslim says that it is a center, a community center that can be open to all also. Then only the permission was given to be built. The municipality was concerned about isolationism, where the mosque may create an isolated entity to the community and the urban fabric. And that is why they insisted that it be opened up to others rather than an isolated architecture. So this is the kind of mosque that we have to be building, a mosque that is in context with the surrounding rather than a mosque which is isolated from the surrounding. There was an incident in Malaysia where a flood had hit Penang, and one of the workers at the mosque had allowed non-Muslims to come into the mosque to take shelter, and he was criticized heavily by Muslims for allowing dirty non-Muslims into the mosque. But what this person have done is to correct thing. The mosque is a place to help those who are in need of help, as in the verses of the Quran as well as in the Hadith about helping the needy. And there is absolutely nothing wrong but should be encouraged. And being dirty in terms of Islamic concept of purity has nothing to do with the social and communal obligation of the Muslim society vis-a-vis the larger. So we encourage or should encourage such activities like the ones on the slide, where Muslims celebrate the Chinese New Year at the Abu Bakr Mosque, within the mosque compound and also part of the building, as well as the Chief Minister of Perak celebrating the Tanglong with the Muslims at a mosque. This is the kind of architecture that we are looking for, or the relationship that we are looking for. More examples of mosques being part of a larger community by celebrating also the Chinese New Year and getting close with the Chinese. The Tun Abdul Aziz Mosque also have the celebration of the Chinese New Year, which is the throwing up or the the Yising ceremony, I guess, is something which we should encourage in. In Australia, the architect had designed the Newport Mosque in Melbourne, and it contains all the contextual element that we have been speaking about, where there is no fence, where the courtyard is an open courtyard, and the wall towards the prayer space is a glass. There are restaurants in front where people can come in, anyone, and the traditional forms of the mosque with the dome, the minaret, the arches is totally disappeared. It's reinterpreted within a modern construct. Even the geometric patterns have become ceiling or forms of ceiling geometries that will throw in geometric patterns of light into the mosque prayer space. So this is contextualism of mosque architecture, idea of the new mosque. Now, as the final part of this lecture, I present this idea of what I call the theory of mosque architecture, where the eternal idea of the mosque is rooted in its idea of Islam being part and parcel of the larger society, and also about modern patterns of life that does not exist in the traditional. And so, in order to derive the brief or program of the mosque, we have to look at the role of the mosque as a community center for all, to provide the curriculum of activities, and then understanding the activity pattern, and also having the architectural elements that is part of the activity pattern, and this will then, the curriculum of the mosque should cover not only traditional teachings of fiqh, Quranic tafsir, and the such, but also some modern classes like physical education, things related to bringing society closer, and fostering a brotherhood, having sports program, family program, program for the young. And so the mosque becomes a lively center, and that is its main role rather than prayer, because Muslims will pray anywhere they are. They will stop whatever activities and work they do, and they will pray. And so the mosque is a facility to bring communities for a prayer space. So this is the bubble diagram that I have put up, and that requires the multifunctional space to be part of the prayer space, so that the prayer space proper becomes smaller. And this is perhaps the model which the Masjid Negara was having. So with some of these examples shown by some of my students, we see the mosque here not having a very huge mass, but broken up massing. No fence or moat around the mosque, very friendly. You can come in, you can see the smaller spaces that will be the library or the shops and the clinic, and games room and tuition centers and stuff. But I also have the one whole area dedicated for women, where no male is allowed to see in. Traditionally, mosques are for male, but women are allowed, and only a small space is dedicated for them. But here I'm giving a whole 1/3 of the site development for the Muslim women, because in Malaysia, women form 50% of the economic and political force, unlike in other countries where most women are only someone to take care of the household. Another mosque idea from one of my students is placing the bazaar under a roof, open air roof, somewhat similar to the Medan of the Isfahan Bazaar, and the mosque proper stands away or out of the Medan, or slightly off center. And when prayer of Friday prayers comes, all the business will stop, and the bazaar will function as a place for prayer. Then after that, it resumes its business activity, open to everyone, not just Muslim, but also non-Muslims, to come in and participate. Thus, in conclusion, Muslims in mosques must engage other communities in order to embrace the larger Islamic spirituality. Plans of mosques must accommodate the engagement of communities, and the elevation, the material should respond to what is now the new role and purpose of the mosque. The idea of the mosque as a sacred icon, totally isolated from the community, the urban fabric, should be no longer there. If we value the idea of nation building and the idea of Islam being dynamic enough to be part and parcel of any modern community, any time, of any age. Socio-political divide between Muslims and non-Muslims can be narrowed if mosques become the glue and not the thorn. So if we have non-Muslims also engaging with the mosque and the Muslim community at the communal level, then we will be on the better road for success.